decided I gotta make myself known as the one who does the kind of cringe speeches. So after years of being emo and listening to emo music such as My Chemical Romance and Fall Out Boy, there had to come a time where I would venture into heavier music, assuming I didn't grow out of emo. As we can see, I have not. I spent a while listening to newer alternative bands, and I fell into the K-pop hole as well, as we know from the last one. Then K-pop Spaces Online was where I ran into this thing called Visual K. I had mutuals on Instagram who liked K-pop, and also this Visual K from Japan that involved, as the name suggests, crazy visuals paired with rock music. This definitely piqued my interest, being someone who has always really enjoyed rock music and was starting to finally come around to metal because of my metalhead brother. So in this speech, I'm going to go through the basics of Visual K and then a timeline from the 80s to the present of what's been going on in the scene. So what exactly is Visual K? Well, the kanji K translates to system or even group, though many have translated it to mean style. The kanji K is used after many J-fashion styles such as Fairy K or Decora K. What's different about Visual K is that it isn't just a fashion subculture, it's more of a broader umbrella term encompassing a classification for bands, a cultural/musical movement, self-expression, nonconformity, and rebellion against the status quo. It began in the 80s, inspired by hair metal and glam rock from the West. The best way to relate it to us is looking at musicians like Kiss or David Bowie. Some groups are also inspired by traditional kabuki theater, which is also cool. X Japan, who are considered the creator of VK in some fashion, had a slogan, psychedelic violence, crime, and visual shock, that kind of evolved into what we call it now, which is VK, through shortening and abbreviating. Visual K is characterized by heavy dramatic makeup, big colorful hair, funky costumes, and a big focus on visuals and performance. And here is a quote from one of the founding members of that band I mentioned, X Japan, explaining what he thinks Visual K is. I thought it was really good. That's from 2011, so when he was a bit older. All right, now for the timeline. As I mentioned, VK started in the 80s with X Japan, who inspired a bunch of other bands to form, the most notable pioneering bands being Buptic, D'Erlanger, Color, Dead End, and Lunacy. Here's a little bit, and I do mean a little bit because I'm over time, of Kurenai by X Japan. Very 80s, very speed metal. After its beginnings in the 80s, VK reached what is arguably its peak/golden era in the 90s and early 2000s. This is when some bands saw actual mainstream success. This is also when it started to creep into the underground music scene in the West. There are many different subgenres and substyles within VK, and this is when we start to see some different aesthetics pop up. Some notable ones include gothic/aristocratic Lolita, where for some reason everyone is really loves France. A lot of band names are French, which is interesting. And Arrow Girl, which is a combination of the words erotic and grotesque. Lovely, isn't it? The most popular bands from the 90s include Malice Miser, L'Arc-en-Ciel, Dir en Grey, Lorraine, and Shazna. Here's a snippet of Au revoir by Malice Miser, who is this one. Those very dramatic vocals and such. The 90s flowed beautifully into the 2000s, and VK was the most stable it's ever been. The only thing different about this decade is that there are new important bands debuting around this time, such as The Gazette, Moi Dis Moi, Versailles, and Un Café. And here is a little bit of Filth and the Beauty by The Gazette, which is another one of my favorite bands. And there's this one. I think the 2010s is probably my favorite era of VK and clearly inspired. A lot of my favorite bands pop up in this decade, many of which still put out music. A lot of veteran VK enjoyers considered Visual K to be dead by this time, but I honestly think it could be considered the most alive it's ever been, maybe after the 90s. By this point, it's still very much underground, perhaps even more than it was, but it's never really been mainstream, so what's new? There still were stable fan bases and small successes to be had by these bands. I can see but struggle to explain as well a change in visual and music during this era. And what was popular in terms of visuals seemed to change, which I think goes to show how fashion evolves over time, even if you're a subculture. As for music, A lot more emo and metalcore bands pop up around this time. And some of my favorite 2010s bands include Dataroma, Jilica, 0.1, Gino Gosan, Femme Fatale, and Kaya, and Gulu Gulu. A really popular song from this time is Grizzly Circus by Dataroma. So, maybe you're wondering now what's going on in the present day. Has it finally died after one last great era? No, I say. In fact, there are lots of new and promising bands showing up since 2020. I am loving this decade so far because I am able to actively participate and consume new stuff, which I always love doing. It's worth noting that the K-pop to VK pipeline is a real thing I've seen and also been a part of. It's real, especially if you liked emo music before K-pop, so by that logic, I could and will argue that VK is gaining a lot of new fans, such as myself, and communities are building themselves on Twitter, Instagram, Discord, and TikTok. The only shame about this current era is that I'm seeing a lot of bands be a bit short-lived and disband after only a couple of years together. The bright side of that, though, is that a lot of these musicians go on to form new bands. For example, the Madna has 2 ex-members of my favorite band, Dataroma. Newer bands from the 2020s so far include Dazzling Bad, Ash Maze, Samvala, the Madna, and a lot of bands from past slides that still put out music, seriously. Bucktick have been a band for like 40 plus years, it's crazy. Here's a tiny bit of Que Sera Sera by Samvala. So, I hope that by listening today, you all, whether caring or not, have learned something new about this cultural and musical phenomenon known as Visual Kei. I always love to learn new things and discover things that I never even knew existed, so I'm glad I was able to inform a small group about something I love dearly, and thank you all for listening.